It's a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to fall away as you gaze up at the night sky. The stars stretch out across the heavens, distant and twinkling, their stories lost to time. But what if, just beyond our vision, there were visitors, beings from another world, watching us? For decades, we've been captivated by the possibility that we are not alone in the universe. Whether through childhood dreams of aliens or late-night discussions about the unexplained, the idea that UFOs might be real has etched itself into the fabric of modern culture. One of the most significant investigations into the mystery of UFOs is Project Blue Book, a covert government initiative conducted by the U.S. Air Force between 1952 and 1969. The goal was simple on the surface: to investigate reports of unidentified flying objects and determine whether they posed a threat to national security. However, the scope of the project quickly expanded far beyond its original intent, as more and more sightings and encounters defied conventional explanation. What started as a military endeavor to identify strange aerial phenomena evolved into a complex, decades-long inquiry into the unknown. It's easy to dismiss UFO sightings as mere fantasy or optical illusions. After all, the idea of visitors from another world is a theme that has long been relegated to science fiction. But for many of the people who witnessed these events, the experiences were nothing short of transformative. Eyewitnesses reported seeing objects that moved with incredible speed and agility, defying the known laws of physics. In some cases, individuals even reported encounters with beings who were not human, abductions, strange lights in the sky, and unexplained craft that left no trace behind. The very existence of Project Blue Book is evidence of the United States government's acknowledgement that something strange was happening. For over 17 years, military personnel, scientists, and investigators combed through thousands of UFO reports, interviewing witnesses, studying radar data, and trying to find answers. But as the years went on, the project found itself entangled in a web of contradictory accounts, political pressure, and an increasing public fascination with extraterrestrials. The official stance of the Air Force was that most sightings could be explained as natural phenomena or man-made objects, whether balloons, aircraft, or even misidentified stars and planets. But this explanation didn't sit well with everyone. For many, the mystery deepened. What were these objects, and why could so many of them not be explained by conventional science? The origins of Project Blue Book trace back to an even earlier era, when UFO sightings first began to gain national attention. In 1947, an event occurred that would forever alter the course of UFO history. A flying object crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, and rumors quickly spread that the wreckage was not of this world. Was it a weather balloon, as the U.S. military would later claim? Or was it a craft from another planet, carrying beings who had made contact with Earth? The incident became the foundation for decades of speculation and conspiracy theories, with witnesses offering conflicting reports about the wreckage, the presence of alien bodies, and the government's subsequent cover-up. In the wake of Roswell, UFO sightings across the United States began to escalate, and public interest in the phenomenon reached unprecedented levels. It was against this backdrop of growing curiosity and suspicion that Project Blue Book was born. The Air Force's initial goal was to investigate UFO sightings and assess whether they posed a threat to national security, particularly in the context of the Cold War. The United States was locked in a tense standoff with the Soviet Union, and any unknown object in the sky was a potential concern. But as the years went by, it became clear that UFOs were not just the domain of military pilots and intelligence agencies. Ordinary people, from farmers and school children to police officers and astronauts, were reporting strange encounters with objects in the sky. Some claimed to have witnessed lights moving in unusual patterns, while others reported seeing craft that appeared to defy the laws of physics. What made these sightings so compelling was the consistency of the reports. While some witnesses might have been mistaken, there were enough accounts from reliable sources to suggest that something extraordinary was happening. In many cases, the witnesses described the same characteristics: disc-shaped objects, hovering in place or moving at incredible speeds, with no discernible means of propulsion. Even more perplexing were the reports of strange interactions between the UFOs and the witnesses, objects that seemed to respond to human presence, disappearing or changing direction when approached. Despite these compelling accounts, the U.S. Air Force dismissed many of the sightings as misidentifications of conventional aircraft, weather phenomena, or man-made objects like balloons. And yet, for every explanation that was offered, there remained a handful of cases that defied logic. Witnesses insisted that what they had seen was unlike anything they had ever encountered before. They described lights in the sky that seemed to defy the laws of physics, objects that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. In some cases, the witnesses reported physical effects, such as electronic malfunctions or strange sensations of paralysis or fear. And for every case that was dismissed, there were more that raised even more questions. One of the most intriguing aspects of Project Blue Book was the psychological impact of these encounters. For many people, witnessing a UFO was a life-changing experience. Some witnesses reported feeling a sense of awe or wonder, while others described intense fear or confusion. The emotional and psychological effects of these experiences were as varied as the sightings themselves. In some cases, the trauma was so profound that witnesses were left struggling to understand what they had seen. Were they victims of mass hysteria, or had they truly encountered something beyond the realm of human understanding? The psychological impact of UFO sightings cannot be overstated. Many of the witnesses described vivid, often unsettling dreams after their encounters, and some even underwent hypnosis in an attempt to uncover repressed memories. These experiences, though deeply personal, contributed to the growing sense that UFOs were not simply a series of random occurrences, but part of a larger, more mysterious phenomenon. While the government sought to reassure the public that there was nothing to fear, the growing number of unexplained cases seemed to suggest otherwise. As the years passed, the mystery surrounding UFOs only deepened. Project Blue Book's investigations continued, but the conclusions were often unsatisfying to both the public and the scientific community. The official reports dismissed most sightings as hoaxes or misidentifications, yet the number of unexplained cases continued to grow. Some cases were labeled as unidentified, meaning that the Air Force could not find a logical explanation. For many, these unresolved cases became the most intriguing of all. In the years since the closure of Project Blue Book, the mystery has only grown. New reports of UFO sightings continue to emerge, with eyewitnesses from around the world describing encounters that defy explanation. In recent years, the U.S. government has begun to declassify more information about UFOs, sparking renewed interest in the phenomenon. The advent of modern technology, including smartphones with high-resolution cameras, has provided new evidence of strange aerial objects that continue to defy scientific explanation. And still, the questions remain: what are these objects? Where do they come from? And what do they want? Project Blue Book may have officially ended in 1969, but its legacy endures. It opened the door to an ongoing conversation about the unknown, one that continues to captivate the public's imagination. As we look up at the stars tonight, the mystery of UFOs and extraterrestrial life is far from over. Could it be that the answers we seek are just beyond our grasp, waiting to be discovered? In the end, the true significance of Project Blue Book may not lie in the answers it provided, but in the questions it raised, questions that continue to challenge our understanding of the world and the universe around us. And so, as we delve into the mysteries of UFOs, we are left with the same question that has haunted humanity for centuries. Are we truly alone? The mid-20th century was a time of great change, technological advancements, and a growing sense of mystery that seemed to permeate the air. With the end of World War II, the world found itself caught in the early years of the Cold War, where every aspect of life, from politics to the scientific community, was marked by tension, secrecy, and the ever-present threat of nuclear war. But amidst this global unease, another kind of uncertainty began to take shape: the question of whether humanity was truly alone in the universe. In 1947, A momentous event occurred that would set the stage for the investigation of UFOs by governments around the world. It was during this year that an incident took place in Roswell, New Mexico, that would eventually give birth to a mythology still alive today. According to official reports, a weather balloon had crashed near Roswell, but the rumors quickly spread that the debris was not of earthly origin. In the years following, stories of alien bodies, government cover-ups, and the mysterious crash would become part of the UFO lore that captivated the public. While the U.S. military quickly dismissed these reports, claiming that what had been recovered was merely a weather balloon, the questions it raised about extraterrestrial life and government secrecy had already taken root in the American psyche. As the Roswell incident faded from the headlines, UFO sightings began to increase across the United States. The 1950s, in particular, saw a dramatic rise in reports of strange lights in the sky and objects that seemed to defy conventional flight patterns. It wasn't just isolated incidents. Citizens from all walks of life were reporting sightings, from farmers and truck drivers to doctors and police officers. These reports were not limited to one region or type of person. The phenomenon seemed to be widespread. The world was witnessing something unknown, and the sheer volume of sightings made it impossible for the government to ignore. It was in the midst of this growing public fascination with UFOs that the United States Air Force decided to take a more formal approach to the phenomenon. In 1948, the Air Force initiated a program known as Project Sign, the first official attempt to investigate the growing number of UFO sightings. The program's initial objective was to determine whether UFOs posed a threat to national security, especially in light of the ongoing tensions of the Cold War. The U.S. government was particularly concerned about the possibility that Soviet intelligence might have developed new, advanced technologies that could potentially be a threat. Project Sign, however, proved to be short-lived. While it did investigate some notable sightings, the program quickly ran into a wall of confusion and contradictions. In many cases, eyewitnesses reported seeing objects that moved in ways no known aircraft could replicate. Yet, there was no tangible evidence that could definitively support the claim that UFOs were extraterrestrial in origin. As a result, Project Sign was followed by Project Grudge in 1949, which was tasked with debunking UFO sightings and reassuring the public that there was no reason to be concerned. Project Grudge, however, became notorious for its dismissive attitude toward UFO reports, as the investigators sought to explain away the phenomena as misidentified natural occurrences or human-made objects. Despite the efforts of Project Grudge, UFO sightings continued unabated, and the public's fascination with the subject grew. In 1952, the Air Force initiated Project Blue Book, a program that would last until 1969 and become the most well-known and controversial UFO investigation effort in history. Unlike its predecessors, Blue Book was designed not only to investigate UFO sightings, but also to systematically document them. The project's goal was twofold: to determine whether UFOs were a national security threat and to investigate the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Project Blue Book was established at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a noted astronomer, being brought on as the project's scientific consultant. Hynek had initially been skeptical about UFOs, but was tasked with reviewing the cases that came through the program. Over time, he became one of the most important figures in UFO research, particularly because of his changing perspective on the phenomenon. Hynek began as a skeptic, dismissing many early UFO reports as misidentifications of conventional objects like weather balloons, military aircraft, or astronomical phenomena. But as Blue Book continued, Hynek found himself grappling with cases that could not be easily explained. His growing belief in the validity of some UFO encounters would later lead him to become a major advocate for the scientific study of UFOs. At the time of its creation, Blue Book was presented to the public as a means of providing transparency and reassurance. The Air Force's official stance was that UFOs were not a threat to national security, and that the majority of sightings could be explained through conventional means. The government's objective was clear: to calm the public's growing anxiety and skepticism while maintaining control over the narrative. Yet, as the years went on, the cases Blue Book investigated began to accumulate. Each new report added another layer of mystery, and some cases defied conventional explanation. The government's decision to downplay UFO sightings through official channels did little to quell public interest. On the contrary, the more the government dismissed UFO encounters, the more the public's curiosity grew. People began to question the motives behind the government's refusal to take the phenomenon seriously, and many began to suspect that the authorities were hiding something. This led to the rise of conspiracy theories, with some believing that the government had already made contact with extraterrestrials and was covering it up. The public's fascination with UFOs was further fueled by the media, which portrayed sightings as mysterious and often sensationalized them. One of the most significant incidents that shaped the narrative surrounding UFOs during this period occurred in 1952, when a series of UFO sightings over Washington, D.C., made headlines across the country. The incident, which involved radar operators tracking strange objects near the U.S. Capitol, was one of the most widely publicized UFO events of the time. The U.S. military responded by sending fighter jets to intercept the unknown craft, but the objects seemingly vanished without a trace. The Washington, D.C. UFO sightings sparked a media frenzy and added fuel to the growing belief that the government was withholding information about extraterrestrial contact. Despite the overwhelming evidence provided by eyewitness accounts, radar data, and even the testimony of military personnel, Blue Book continued to dismiss the majority of UFO sightings as misidentifications. However, there were cases that the Air Force could not explain away. These included reports from military pilots, law enforcement officers, and scientists, people whose credibility was hard to dispute. In the face of such testimony, the Air Force was forced to acknowledge that some cases remained unresolved. As Project Blue Book continued into the 1960s, its efforts to explain UFO sightings became increasingly difficult. In 1966, the U.S. Air Force commissioned a report from the University of Colorado, known as the Condon Report, to investigate the UFO phenomenon. The report ultimately concluded that there was no evidence to support the existence of UFOs or extraterrestrial life. However, the report's findings were controversial, and many UFO researchers and enthusiasts believed that it was more of a cover-up than an objective analysis. The final days of Blue Book in 1969 saw the project officially shut down, with the Air Force concluding that UFOs posed no threat to national security. However, the closure of the project did not mark the end of UFO sightings or government involvement in the phenomenon. Over the years, new reports would surface, and the debate over what UFOs truly are, whether they are extraterrestrial visitors, advanced military technology, or something else entirely, would continue to captivate the public's imagination. Despite the official conclusions of Project Blue Book, the legacy of the program remains a point of contention. The cases investigated by Blue Book continue to fuel the ongoing debate about UFOs. Whether or not the Air Force was intentionally withholding information, the truth remains elusive. What were the objects that Blue Book could not explain? Are they truly from another world? Or is there a more terrestrial explanation? And why, after decades of investigation, does the government still maintain that there is nothing to fear? Project Blue Book may have ended, but the questions it raised remain. The legacy of the project lives on in the ongoing search for answers, as new generations of researchers, enthusiasts, and even the U.S. government continue to explore the mystery of UFOs. And as the world moves further into the 21st century, the question of whether we are alone in the universe remains as tantalizing as ever. One of the most iconic and unsettling UFO cases in history is the 1961 abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, a couple from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Their story not only became the first widely publicized alien abduction case in the United States, but also played a crucial role in shaping the public's perception of extraterrestrial encounters. The Hills experience, which would later be dubbed America's first alien abduction, is filled with chilling details that defy rational explanation. But even more than the events themselves, it was the psychological impact on the Hills and the cultural ripple effect it had on UFO phenomena that would make this case so enduring. It was a quiet night on September 19, 1961, when Betty and Barney Hill, traveling back from vacation in Canada, found themselves on a lonely stretch of road in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. They had been driving for hours, heading south toward home, when they suddenly noticed a bright light in the sky. At first, they assumed it was a star or an airplane, but as the light grew larger and moved erratically, they realized it was something much stranger. Barney, a postal worker, was driving, and as he pulled over to get a better look, Betty, a social worker, became increasingly anxious. They watched as the object appeared to hover just above the horizon, growing larger by the minute. What happened next is the subject of much debate. According to the Hills, the object descended, and before they knew it, they were being followed by it. The couple described the object as a huge, silent, and bright light. As they attempted to drive away, the object seemed to follow them, maintaining its position in the sky. After some time, they stopped at a roadside diner, attempting to make sense of what they had witnessed. But it wasn't until later that night, after they resumed their journey, that the true horror of their experience began to unfold. At some point during the drive, the Hills felt as though they had lost time. They didn't remember how they had gotten from one part of the road to another, and they had no recollection of certain stretches of the journey. When they finally arrived home, they discovered that they were hours behind their expected arrival time. Their clothes were disheveled, and they felt an overwhelming sense of dread and confusion. Over the following days, both Betty and Barney began experiencing vivid, unsettling dreams and flashbacks of what they had witnessed that night, which they had difficulty processing. Something had happened, but what? The couple had no memory of what had occurred during the missing hours, and it was only through hypnosis that the full extent of their experience began to emerge. A few weeks after the incident, the Hills sought help from a psychiatrist, Dr. Benjamin Simon, who specialized in post-traumatic stress and hypnosis. During their sessions, both Betty and Barney began to recall disturbing images and sensations from that night. Through deep hypnosis, they revealed that they had been taken aboard a spacecraft by beings who were not human. The beings were described as small, with large, almond-shaped eyes and grayish skin. Barney, in particular, seemed deeply disturbed by the memory of being physically examined by these beings. He described a sense of paralysis and helplessness as they conducted their tests, with no explanation or comfort provided. Betty's recollections were more vivid and specific. She described being shown a star map by one of the beings, and this map became one of the most intriguing elements of the Hill case. Betty later drew a representation of the map, which was remarkably similar to a star system later identified as Zeta Reticuli. At the time of her hypnosis, Betty had no knowledge of this star system, and the fact that the star map she drew bore a striking resemblance to a map later confirmed by astronomers raised serious questions about the veracity of the Hills' experience. The Hills' hypnosis sessions were not just a means of uncovering repressed memories. They also became the basis for the public's first introduction to the idea of alien abductions. Prior to this case, UFO sightings were typically dismissed as misidentifications of aircraft or natural phenomena. But the Hills story added an entirely new layer to the UFO phenomenon, the idea that extraterrestrial beings were not only visiting our planet, but were also interacting with humans in an intimate and often terrifying way. As the story of Betty and Barney's abduction spread through the media, it sparked a national conversation about UFOs and alien encounters. The Hills case was unlike anything the public had encountered before. Not only did they claim to have been taken aboard a spacecraft, but their story was also backed by medical and psychological evidence. The hypnosis sessions were recorded, and their accounts were consistent with the details they had recalled independently. Both Betty and Barney passed polygraph tests, which further validated their experience in the eyes of many. But despite the compelling nature of their story, there were also skeptics who sought to discredit the Hills. Some believed that the couple's traumatic experience was simply a product of stress, caused by the pressures of their personal lives or the anxiety surrounding the Cold War. Others suggested that their memories had been influenced by popular culture, which was saturated with stories of aliens and UFOs. The growing UFO craze of the 1950s and 1960s, fueled by the rise of science fiction films, may have shaped the Hills' recollections, some argued. The idea that they had been brainwashed by their own exposure to alien narratives gained traction among critics of the abduction phenomenon. However, there were elements of the case that defied easy explanation. For one, the Hills' missing time was a phenomenon that many other UFO abductees would report in subsequent years. The idea of lost time became a hallmark of abduction cases, and the psychological and emotional effects it had on witnesses were deeply unsettling. The Hills, like many other abductees, struggled to reconcile their memories of the event with their everyday lives. They both became increasingly reclusive, and their relationship suffered as a result of the trauma they experienced. Betty later wrote a book about the abduction entitled The Interrupted Journey, which further cemented their place in UFO history. The Betty and Barney Hill abduction case also had a profound impact on the cultural landscape of the 1960s. The notion of alien abductions began to take root in the popular imagination, sparking countless books, films, and television shows about extraterrestrial encounters. The Hills' story became a template for future abduction narratives, and many subsequent cases bore striking similarities to their experience. From the descriptions of grays to the idea of a star map, the Hill case set the stage for the modern concept of alien abduction, which would later be explored in detail in works like John Mack's Abduction, and the numerous UFO documentaries and TV specials that followed. But the Hill case was not just a cultural milestone. It also raised important questions about the nature of human perception, memory, and trauma. Was Betty and Barney Hill's abduction a literal encounter with extraterrestrial beings, or was it a psychological event, one shaped by their fears, desires, and the cultural zeitgeist of the time? And if it was psychological, what does that say about the power of the mind to create experiences that feel just as real as anything physical? These questions remain central to the study of UFOs and abductions, as each new case introduces fresh mysteries and potential answers. In the decades since the Hills abduction, their case has continued to capture the imagination of UFO enthusiasts, researchers, and skeptics alike. Some believe that their experience was a genuine extraterrestrial encounter, while others maintain that it was the product of a collective psychological phenomenon. Regardless of one's perspective, the story of Betty and Barney Hill is undeniable. It opened the door to a new realm of possibility and set the stage for a lifetime of questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the unexplained. In the summer of 1952, a series of UFO sightings over Washington, D.C., ignited one of the most widely publicized UFO events in history. For several nights in July, the nation's capital was the focal point of strange and unexplained aerial phenomena. The sightings were not limited to just one or two people or even a single event. They were witnessed by numerous individuals, including military personnel, air traffic controllers, and even a host of civilian observers. What started as a simple sighting quickly evolved into a mystery that would captivate the public's imagination and leave the U.S. government scrambling for answers. It was the night of July 19th to 20th, 1952, when the first significant sighting occurred. Radar operators at Washington National Airport, now Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, began to notice unidentified objects on their screens. The objects appeared at high altitudes and moved with an unexplainable speed and precision. What made these sightings even more troubling was that the radar operators were able to track the objects as they maneuvered in ways that defied known aircraft capabilities. As the objects appeared to move erratically, the airport's control tower attempted to make contact, but no response came from the objects in the sky. In the hours that followed, additional reports came in from different radar stations, each corroborating the sightings. At the same time, several pilots reported seeing strange lights in the sky. The objects were described as bright, moving in and out of the radar's range, sometimes speeding up and at other times slowing down or hovering in place. These sightings were particularly unsettling to the military and air traffic controllers, who were trained to detect and identify aircraft, weather phenomena, or other known objects. Yet, these strange objects defied all conventional explanations. The next night, on July 20th to 21st, the sightings continued, this time with even greater intensity. As military jets were scrambled to intercept the unknown objects, the situation grew more tense. Air Force pilots attempted to make visual contact with the UFOs, but the objects seemed to avoid them, darting away at speeds that were impossible for human-made aircraft to match. The radar continued to track the objects, but the military pilots could not locate them visually. It was a scene of complete confusion and frustration, as the Air Force had no explanation for what was happening in the skies above Washington. The Washington, D.C. UFO flyover lasted for several nights, with additional sightings reported through the end of July. By this point, the events had gained the attention of the media, and the story made front-page headlines across the country. The Washington Post, for example, published a piece titled "Air Force Seeks UFO Explanation," in which the Air Force tried to reassure the public that the objects were simply a case of misidentified weather phenomena or the result of high-altitude temperature inversions that caused radar anomalies. However, this explanation did little to calm the growing sense of unease among the public, who were now questioning whether the government was hiding something more serious. The psychological impact of the Washington, D.C. UFO sightings was profound. For many, it was the first time that the phenomenon of UFOs seemed to take on a tangible and urgent reality. Prior to this event, UFO sightings were often dismissed as isolated incidents, sometimes written off as hoaxes or mistaken perceptions. But the 1952 sightings over Washington were different. They were witnessed by credible individuals, military personnel, and air traffic controllers, who had no reason to fabricate their accounts. The sightings were also supported by radar data, which added a level of credibility that previous UFO sightings had lacked. The government's reaction to the Washington, D.C. UFO sightings was one of both concern and confusion. Officials were concerned because the objects appeared to be undetectable by conventional means. The fact that they were visible on radar, yet eluded visual confirmation from military pilots, raised serious questions about the nature of these objects. If the objects were a foreign threat, they could be an advanced piece of Soviet technology. The possibility that they were some form of military aircraft from another nation was a terrifying prospect, especially during the tense years of the Cold War. Yet, despite intense scrutiny and investigation, the government could not identify the objects as anything conventional. The Air Force's public explanations, ranging from weather balloons to radar malfunctions, were met with increasing skepticism. The cultural impact of the Washington, D.C. UFO flyover was far-reaching. Prior to these events, UFOs had been largely relegated to the fringes of popular culture. They were the stuff of science fiction films, pulp magazines, and whispered stories. But the events over Washington, D.C. brought UFOs into the mainstream in a way that had never been seen before. The idea that UFOs could be an actual, tangible phenomenon that defied explanation became a subject of intense public fascination. For the general public, the idea of unidentified flying objects appearing in the nation's capital was both thrilling and terrifying. The images of bright lights darting across the sky, combined with the reports of military jets being unable to intercept them, seemed to suggest that the U.S. government was facing an unknown and potentially hostile force. The idea of extraterrestrial life, long a subject of debate in scientific circles, suddenly gained a new level of plausibility. If these objects were not from Earth, what could they be? Where were they from? And why were they over Washington, D.C., the heart of the U.S. government? As the media frenzy around the Washington, D.C. UFO flyover continued, the Air Force was forced to hold a press conference in an attempt to address the growing public concern. The government's official position was that there was no evidence to suggest that the UFOs were of extraterrestrial origin. The objects, the Air Force insisted, were likely misidentified natural phenomena or the result of radar anomalies. But despite this official stance, the public remained unconvinced. For many, the government's inability to provide a clear explanation only fueled the belief that a cover-up was underway. The 1952 Washington, D.C. UFO flyover would go down in history as one of the most significant and mysterious events in the early years of the UFO phenomenon. While the government eventually closed the book on the incident with a series of inconclusive explanations, the public's interest in UFOs had already been piqued. The Washington, D.C. sightings were not just a brief flare-up in the UFO saga. They were a turning point. They raised the stakes, asking a question that would resonate for decades to come. If these objects were not of earthly origin, what did that mean for humanity's understanding of the universe? In the years that followed, the Washington, D.C. UFO flyover would continue to capture the imagination of UFO enthusiasts and researchers. It became a case study in government secrecy, public reaction, and the growing belief that UFOs represented something beyond the scope of conventional understanding. As new technologies emerged and more sightings were reported, the Washington, D.C. incident remained a touchstone, a reminder that the question of UFOs was far from over. The objects in the skies over Washington were not just a mystery for the Air Force to solve. They were a challenge for all of humanity to confront. In the early afternoon of April 6, 1966, a group of students and teachers at Grangehorse Primary School and Westall High School in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, were witness to one of the most compelling and puzzling UFO sightings in history. The Westall UFO incident, as it would come to be known, remains one of the most significant cases in UFO history, particularly because it involved so many credible witnesses, including school children, educators, and experienced pilots. Despite the overwhelming number of witnesses, the Australian government and local authorities have largely dismissed the event, keeping it shrouded in mystery and uncertainty. On that spring afternoon, just after 11 a.m., students and faculty alike noticed a strange object in the sky. The object was described as being a flying saucer or disc-shaped craft, with a silvery or metallic surface. It hovered for several moments before it moved in an erratic manner, quickly gaining altitude before disappearing behind a line of trees. The sighting lasted for a period of around 10 to 15 minutes, with many witnesses able to view the object through the windows of the classrooms or directly from the schoolyard. Some described the object as making a humming noise, while others reported hearing no sound at all. As the object disappeared behind the trees, the reaction among the students and staff was one of confusion and awe. Several students ran to nearby fields and bushland in an attempt to follow the object. Others remained on the school grounds, discussing what they had seen. Some were frightened, while others were fascinated. It was an unusual and seemingly unexplainable event, but it wasn't until the following hours that the scope of the incident became fully apparent. As news of the sighting spread, several local residents came forward with their own reports of similar sightings that day, further solidifying the credibility of the event. One particularly important witness to the event was an experienced pilot named Keith Basterfield, who claimed to have seen the object with his own eyes. He described it as having a smooth metallic surface, moving with no visible propulsion, and making sudden, sharp turns. Basterfield's testimony was especially important because it came from a man with a clear understanding of aviation and what would be considered normal or abnormal flight patterns. His report helped lend credibility to the idea that the object was not a conventional aircraft. The Australian government, however, responded to the Westall UFO incident with indifference, offering no official explanation or investigation. Within hours, school officials and local police had been instructed to downplay the incident, discouraging students and teachers from discussing what they had seen. Those who spoke out were met with skepticism, and many witnesses were told not to report the sighting to the media. Despite the suppression of information, several of the witnesses went on to speak publicly about what they had seen, including students who had captured sketches of the UFO and teachers who described their own experiences. The reluctance of the authorities to address the incident left many witnesses feeling disillusioned, and the cover-up efforts only fueled the fire of conspiracy theories. Why had the authorities reacted with such apparent indifference to an event witnessed by so many people? Was there something more to the story that the government didn't want the public to know? As the years went by, the story of the Westall UFO incident became a topic of increasing interest for UFO researchers and enthusiasts, many of whom felt that the case had been ignored due to its potential implications. One of the most curious aspects of the Westall UFO incident is the number of witnesses who were never formally interviewed or investigated. Over 200 students and faculty members had reportedly witnessed the event, yet only a small number of them were ever questioned by authorities. It wasn't until decades later that the full extent of the witness testimony began to surface, with former students and teachers recalling their experiences on camera and in interviews. Many of these individuals described how the event had left a lasting impression on them, and how they had struggled to make sense of what they had seen. The lack of an official explanation for the Westall incident led to widespread speculation about what had actually occurred that day. Some believed that the object was a secret military aircraft, possibly of experimental design, and that the authorities had chosen to keep the event under wraps to prevent public panic. This theory was partly fueled by the fact that the sighting occurred not far from a nearby military base, and some witnesses claimed that they had seen military jets in pursuit of the object. Others suggested that the object was of extraterrestrial origin, given its unconventional flight patterns and behavior. Still, others argued that the entire event had been a collective hallucination, a result of mass hysteria or the power of suggestion. For those who believed that the Westall UFO incident was a genuine extraterrestrial encounter, the implications were profound. If the object seen that day was indeed from another world, what did that mean for humanity's place in the universe? The notion that a UFO could appear over a major city and be witnessed by so many people raised troubling questions about government secrecy, the nature of alien life, and the possibility of contact with beings from other planets. The fact that the Australian government had been so dismissive of the event only served to deepen the mystery, as many wondered what the authorities knew that they weren't telling the public. Despite the lack of an official explanation, the Westall UFO incident has remained a source of fascination and intrigue. In the years following the event, local UFO enthusiasts and researchers began to investigate the case in greater detail. In 1993, a group of UFO researchers conducted an investigation into the incident, interviewing witnesses and collecting evidence. They found that many of the witnesses had been told to keep quiet about what they had seen, and several recalled feeling pressure to deny their experiences. The researchers also found that the nearby military base had been involved in a number of secret activities at the time, though no concrete evidence linked the base to the UFO sighting. In 2012, a group of former students and teachers from Westall High School organized a reunion to discuss the event and to try to piece together what had happened that day. Many of the witnesses who attended the reunion reported that the event had a profound impact on their lives, and many still believed that the object they had seen was of extraterrestrial origin. The reunion was a poignant reminder of the lasting effect that the Westall UFO incident had on those who had witnessed it, and how the mystery surrounding it still lingered decades later. The case of the Westall UFO incident raises important questions about the nature of UFO sightings and how they are handled by authorities. It also highlights the role of eyewitness testimony in shaping the narrative of UFO encounters. The overwhelming number of witnesses who saw the object that day, combined with the lack of a satisfactory explanation from the government, has led many to believe that the truth about what happened at Westall is still being hidden. Despite the many years that have passed since the event, the Westall UFO incident remains one of the most intriguing and perplexing cases in the history of UFO sightings. It is a reminder that the mysteries of the universe may still be out there, just beyond our understanding, waiting to be discovered. On the night of October 11, 1973, two men, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, were fishing along the banks of the Pascagoula River in southeastern Mississippi when they experienced what would become one of the most extraordinary and terrifying encounters in UFO history. The Pascagoula UFO encounter stands out not only for the dramatic nature of the event itself, but also for the subsequent psychological effects on the witnesses and the ongoing mystery surrounding what happened that night. The case remains one of the most widely discussed UFO abduction stories, particularly due to the credibility of the witnesses involved, both of whom underwent hypnosis and polygraph testing to support their claims. The incident began when Hickson and Parker, both in their early 20s, were sitting in a small boat, fishing under a calm, moonlit sky. At approximately 9 p.m., they noticed a strange, blue light moving in their direction across the water. Initially, they assumed it was a boat approaching, but the light quickly grew in size and intensity, moving in a manner that suggested it was no ordinary vessel. The two men described the light as being brighter than any boat's headlight and of an unnatural, almost eerie quality. As the light moved closer, it took on a more defined shape, a large, disc-shaped object hovering just above the water. The object emitted a pulsating, almost hypnotic glow, and the men were drawn into a sense of bewilderment and fear. As the object hovered above them, Hickson and Parker became increasingly alarmed. They began to move away from the light, but before they could react, the object abruptly descended and hovered just a few feet above their boat. In a surreal and inexplicable moment, the men suddenly felt a force pulling them toward the craft. At that moment, both men were paralyzed by a strange, invisible force and felt their bodies being lifted out of the boat and into the craft. What happened next would forever alter Hickson and Parker's understanding of reality. They were taken aboard the craft, where they encountered beings that neither man could adequately describe. Hickson later described the beings as humanoid, but with a peculiar and unsettling appearance. They were short, with robotic-like features, grayish skin, and no visible eyes, ears, or mouths. The beings were reportedly faceless and communicated with the men telepathically, giving the impression that they were somehow being controlled or manipulated. The sensation was described as cold and invasive, with the beings performing strange examinations on the men. Hickson and Parker were subjected to a series of tests, some of which they later struggled to understand or explain. Hickson described a feeling of helplessness, as if his body was being manipulated without his consent. The sensation of being examined was deeply traumatic, and both men felt violated in ways they could not fully comprehend at the time. After what felt like an eternity, both men were suddenly returned to their boat and set down by the craft. The object hovered for a few moments before rapidly ascending and disappearing into the night sky. The entire event lasted only about 20 minutes, but for Hickson and Parker, it felt like much longer. The men were left in shock, unsure of what they had just experienced. They attempted to make sense of the event, but the fear and confusion were overwhelming. Neither man spoke to anyone about the experience immediately, as they were unsure whether to report the incident or dismiss it as a strange, collective hallucination. However, later that night, the two men went to the nearby police station to report what they had seen. Initially, the officers were skeptical of their story, dismissing it as an elaborate hoax or a drunken misinterpretation of a natural event. However, after further questioning, Hickson and Parker maintained their accounts with remarkable consistency. The police officers, recognizing the sincerity of their testimony, contacted a local UFO researcher, Dr. James Harder, to investigate the case. Dr. Harder, a prominent figure in UFO research, conducted interviews with the two men and took them through hypnosis sessions to recover more details of the event. Under hypnosis, Hickson and Parker's recollections became more vivid, and they were able to recall additional details about the beings and their examination. Hickson, who was a highly rational and level-headed individual, had difficulty accepting what had happened to him. However, through the hypnosis sessions, he became convinced that he had undergone an alien encounter. Parker, on the other hand, struggled with the emotional trauma of the experience. The experience deeply affected his mental health, and he became reclusive, unwilling to discuss the incident for many years. As the investigation into the Pascagoula UFO encounter progressed, the two men were subjected to polygraph tests to determine the truthfulness of their accounts. Both men passed the polygraph tests, a fact that further validated their testimony in the eyes of many UFO researchers. Despite the results, the media and the public remained divided over the validity of their claims. Skeptics argued that the men had fabricated the story for attention or financial gain, while others suggested that the incident could have been the result of a collective hallucination or the product of extreme psychological stress. One of the key elements that made the Pascagoula encounter stand out was the psychological and emotional toll it took on both Hickson and Parker. The experience shattered their previous understanding of reality and left them with lingering questions about the nature of their encounter. Hickson, in particular, struggled with feelings of isolation and alienation, as he found it difficult to relate to those who had not experienced such an extraordinary event. For years, Hickson remained a vocal proponent of the authenticity of the encounter, even as his story was met with ridicule and skepticism. In the years following the encounter, the Pascagoula UFO case became one of the most enduring and controversial UFO abduction stories. While some dismiss it as a hoax or a product of imagination, others consider it one of the most credible and compelling pieces of evidence for the existence of extraterrestrial life. The fact that two ordinary men with no prior history of UFO involvement reported such an extraordinary experience, and that their testimony remained consistent over the years, adds weight to the argument that something truly remarkable occurred that night in Pascagoula. Over time, the Pascagoula UFO encounter has been examined in documentaries, books, and television specials, solidifying its place in UFO lore. The case has become a cornerstone of UFO abduction narratives, and Hickson and Parker's testimony continues to resonate with those who believe in the reality of extraterrestrial encounters. In the decades since the event, both Hickson and Parker have passed away, but their story endures as one of the most fascinating and perplexing UFO encounters in history. The Pascagoula UFO encounter remains a key case in the ongoing search for evidence of extraterrestrial life. The event raises important questions about the nature of alien encounters, human memory, and the limits of scientific understanding. While the truth about what happened that night may never be fully understood, the testimony of Hickson and Parker serves as a reminder that there are still many mysteries in the universe waiting to be explored. Their encounter stands as one of the most significant cases in the history of UFO phenomena, a case that continues to provoke debate and curiosity among UFO researchers, skeptics, and the public alike. The Rendlesham Forest incident is often referred to as Britain's Roswell, due to its chilling similarities to the infamous 1947 UFO crash in New Mexico. What makes this case so intriguing, however, is not just the array of strange phenomena observed, but the sheer number of credible witnesses, military personnel, airmen, and government officials who were involved. Over the course of several nights in late December 1980, a series of unexplained and highly anomalous events occurred near the Rendlesham Forest, located just outside the RAF Royal Air Force, Woodbridge Base in Suffolk, England. Despite decades of investigation, speculation, and debate, the incident remains shrouded in mystery, with no conclusive explanation for what happened. The series of strange occurrences began on the night of December 26, 1980, when two USAF security officers, Jim Peniston and John Burroughs, were on patrol near the perimeter of the base. They were initially alerted to unusual lights in the forest, which they thought might be a downed aircraft or a vehicle. Upon investigation, they encountered a strange metallic object hovering just above the ground, emanating a bright light. The object was described as being triangular in shape, with a series of multicolored lights along its sides. As Peniston and Burroughs cautiously approached the craft, they observed it slowly moving through the trees before suddenly ascending rapidly into the sky and vanishing without a trace. What followed in the coming days added more layers to the mystery. The next night, on December 27, 1980, more military personnel, including Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander at RAF Woodbridge, were involved in a follow-up investigation. They were accompanied by several other security personnel who had seen strange lights in the sky and had heard reports of unusual disturbances in the forest. According to Halt's later testimony, when they entered the forest, they were immediately struck by an intense, inexplicable light show. The lights appeared to move erratically across the sky, almost as if they were intelligently controlled. As the group ventured deeper into the forest, they encountered a pulsating beam of light, which they later described as being emanating from a small, triangular-shaped craft hovering just above the ground. Halt's report, famously known as the Halt Memorandum, was one of the most significant pieces of documentation to come out of the Rendlesham incident. In it, Halt described in detail the bizarre sequence of events that unfolded that night, including the strange beams of light and the palpable sense of unease that permeated the group. The memorandum noted how the group attempted to make contact with the object, but despite their efforts, the craft disappeared and reappeared several times, moving erratically and performing maneuvers that were beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft. Halt's report also documented unusual physical effects, such as animals in the area acting agitated and electronic equipment malfunctioning when close to the object. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of the Rendlesham Forest encounter was the physical aftermath. Both Peniston and Burroughs, along with several other witnesses, reported experiencing a range of psychological and physiological symptoms following their encounter with the UFO. Peniston, in particular, had vivid memories of the craft, and even later claimed to have experienced a download of binary code from a craft. According to his account, after touching the craft, he began to experience strange sensations, including a heightened awareness of what was happening around him. He claimed to have received a series of numbers, which he later interpreted as a code. Over the years, Peniston's claims would be further explored, with some suggesting that the numbers were part of a communication from extraterrestrial beings. However, these claims were met with skepticism and doubts regarding their authenticity. What made the Rendlesham Forest incident particularly compelling was not just the bizarre nature of the sighting, but the sheer number of credible witnesses involved.